Well, thanks so much for having me. Like Matt, I found out I was speaking a few days in advance, so we'll see how this goes. First things third. Stephen Covey wrote a best-selling book called 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. And one of the habits he listed was put first things first. This was not the first, not the second. It was the third habit in his list. It was behind being proactive and begin with an end in mind. Now, to be a little logically semantic about this, this is actually a bit of an amusing paradox. How could first things first, putting first things first, not be the first item? Being proactive is a means of achieving an end, a means of achieving the end that you would want to have in mind. But how could you know what end is worth having in mind if you don't know what is relatively better than other things? Similarly, being proactive is not useful if the action that you're taking will leave you no better off than having done nothing. It would seem that beginning with first things first, putting first things first, which is what allows you to understand what is relatively better than other things, is what makes being proactive and is what makes beginning with an end in mind meaningful things to do. Nevertheless, he put it as the third habit, and I believe that there is a good reason to think about putting first things first in this way. Why should it be third? There's no one I can think of who explains these sorts of paradoxical orderings better than the classical white working class American Mike Rowe. Now, Mike Rowe, in one of the episodes of Dirty Jobs, explained his concept of safety third. In all of his explorations of complicated workplaces and often dangerous workplaces, it seemed that everywhere is plastered, safety first, safety first. Everyone is told to repeat safety first. And it didn't seem to make people safer, though. And the thought occurred to him that maybe safety is not first, but third, after he was out on a crab fishing vessel out in the Bering Sea, about 200 miles off the coast of Russia. And they were out on this boat in 30-foot waves. He's 40 feet up in the air, lashing crab pots together, and he feels like he's going to die. There is no safety rails. People are walking around, doing their job, getting just overrun with water, and he eventually, terrified, staggers to the bridge where the captain's sitting over his wheel, looking out at the water. He says, "Captain, OSHA?" Captain's like, "OSHA? Ocean." The pair chuckled about this for a moment, and the crab fisherman said, "Son, I'm a crab fisherman. I'm a captain of a crab boat. My job's not to bring you home safe. My job's to bring you home rich. If you want to come home alive, that's on you." Needless to say, the complacency that led to unsafe work environments was not a problem. Mike Rowe described grabbing every railing, making sure every knot was tied securely. Nothing was amiss on his watch for his own safety, because he knew that it was on him. So putting safety first, in other words, resulted in less safety. Putting safety third left room for a more safe work environment. Sort of odd. In the same way that Stephen Covey put first things first, third. So then the question becomes, what are our priorities? What are the most important things for us? Well, in our current political climate, it would seem that one of the most important things that has been neglected, and dangerously so, is the subject of identity, specifically the subject of race. Now, the reasons why this matter, you could look at from a biological angle. You could say that, biologically speaking, if your lineage gets cut off, you're doomed. That's end of the line. You're done. So the preservation of your lineage is very important. And leaving a legacy for your lineage, an inheritance of language, of land, of wealth, of knowledge, to perform a skill, to make your way in the world. Those are all means that we increase the odds of the survival of our lineage. But if our lineage is not like us, then the inheritance that we leave for them may not be as useful as it was to us. We may have left less to give to our offspring, and the likelihood of their success may be significantly diminished. Race, or nation, if you prefer, is the group that allows our offspring to be enough like us for our inheritance to be meaningful for them, so that the English literature, the classical high English literature, Shakespeare, for instance, won't become just sheets of scrap paper to descendants of ours who only speak Arabic and Cantonese. It's what makes our architecture beautiful and useful to them, rather than them doing other things than going to cathedrals. But suppose that there was no biology to race. Suppose that wasn't convincing to your audience. The fact that that might be the case doesn't make race or nation any less relevant, because that is how we are grouped, whether we want to be or not. Race matters to other people who see us as one group and want to do away with us, in the case of South Africa, or our women, in the case of most of Europe, or of our monuments and our history, if you live in the South. So, should race be first then? Wouldn't that logically follow? It's the most relevant thing to do. Maybe. Maybe not, though. There's a gap between the new right and the public at large, the audience we want to reach. There's a gap between what we think is allowed to be important, and addressing that gap head on can sometimes be like putting safety first. Maybe not in exactly the same means, but the ends of not quite achieving what we desire can nevertheless happen. Perhaps it's because identity politics has been grouped in with all kinds of victimhood politics. A right-wing person who has never read Nietzsche in their life might nevertheless see the danger of becoming resentful, being like the Black Lives Matter activists. And all they hear when they think identity politics, or identity generally, this is something I've heard recently, any talk of having an identity is akin to being a victim in their mind. And then when you ask them, well, what does it mean to be an American? They get deer in the headlights look. Or perhaps they have negative associations that have been drilled into them over the years between any appreciation of being a part of a larger group and genocidal warfare. But regardless of what the reasons might be why people will have these issues, at the moment, it's difficult to get through. There's a gap, and we need to figure out how to resolve that gap. So if race being the most important thing at the moment isn't the first thing, what would the first thing be? Perhaps free speech might be the first thing. Is anyone here familiar with what's happened with Marcus Meechan in the last 2 days? The jokester who taught his pug to do the Nazi salute is now facing up to a year in prison in the United Kingdom for memeing too hard. This is serious. But at the end of the day, free speech isn't an argument. Free speech isn't what will get people out of bed in the morning. Free speech is just a means. It's a tool that lets us get to what we want, but it isn't the thing we want itself. No. I think what really motivates people, and what should come first for a variety of reasons, is religiosity. Now, religiosity is not exactly the same thing as religion, although there's a lot of similarities between the two things. Religion is the state of affiliation with a particular belief or a myth or a group of people, a story. But there's a lot of people who say, oh, I'm Christian, I'm not a very good Christian, I go to church, or I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. How nice. Yeah, no, religiosity is about participation. Religiosity is about doing the work. It's about participating in the rituals. It's about going through the motions, whether you believe it or not, whether you're certain in it or not, is doing what your people do. And this doesn't even always have to happen in a particularly classically religious context. It doesn't need to be in one of the big religions. One of the most religious expressions of spirituality I've heard in the last few years came from a Dutchman by the name of Wim Hof. Perhaps a few of you have heard of him. And he said in an interview, he said, "To me, God is cold. I see it as a noble force, as a force that's constantly training me, is making me better, is bringing me back to the nature and the way it was supposed to be. In that way, I do not only endure the cold, I love it. I love the cold." That's what he said. And you think of a more religious expression, and this is something he does every day. He immerses himself in ice water for hours at a time. He does all sorts of other crazy stuff, too, that his training has allowed him to do. And it's that participation, that relationship with the cold, that's what makes him a religious person, and not just a spiritual person. So how would this be helpful to us in the right? Well, there's a lot of what you might say metapolitical benefits that this provides. When we become a member of the group we are trying to persuade, we become trustworthy to them. When Aristotle talked about the tools for rhetoric, how to persuade people, one of the tools he talked about was ethos, the appeal to a common spirit. Well, you need to be a member of a group in order to appeal to that values of that group. And Cicero later made the point that 90% of the persuasion that's accomplished in a speech is done long before the first word of the speech is ever made. You have to have lived a life that allows you to say what you're about to say to these people. So there's a persuasive value to it. But to look at religiosity based on the utility that you can get in it, how you can manipulate people and persuade them to what you think, is to miss the real point of religiosity. Because religiosity has intrinsic benefits that will help us live better lives. Dr. Robertson of Stanford University said that there's almost nothing you can do to improve the quality of your life better than becoming religious. It adds on average 5 years to your life. It decreases your cortisol in your bloodstream, makes you less stressed. And religious groups participating in a religious community connects you with a multi-generational group of people that has shown in study after study to make people happier, live longer, and more successful, whether it's Okinawa, Loma Linda, California, or Sardinia in Italy. National Geographic wrote a great piece about this several years ago, and it's been only more verified the more we've studied this. The Harvard study of longitudinal men's health has showed this out as well. When men and women live in multi-generational communities together where they're mutually interdependent, we do better. Because in the end, we're not designed to live alone. We're designed to live in groups. And being spiritual without being religious is just saying, I want to be thought of as pious without doing the work of getting along with and learning about others. So it makes us healthier, and it makes us more successful in life because two are stronger than one. This is true in Christianity, and it's true of pre-Christian symbolism that's recently developed a rather negative association. The fasces is about that concept. When you take one stick, it is easy to break, but many sticks bound together are strong. If this is considered too fascist for many people, then they should look at the symbolism used in the United States federal offices and the armrests of Abraham Lincoln in front of his monument. It was at the heart of the American government, just as it was at the heart of the Roman government 2,000 years ago. So, religiosity, what does that look like in practice? There's a subtle undercurrent, and I think to our credit, it's a little bit weaker in the alt-right than in the Republican Party, and certainly weaker than it is in the Democratic Party. But it's there nonetheless, that in order to be successful, we need to plan out how we will persuade people. How will we trick them or manipulate them into thinking about these things the correct way. And not only do I think the most valuable people, but even the less intelligent people have an eye for picking out that kind of motivation. And it doesn't work in the long run. But more importantly than that, it misses out on all the benefits that we can get from being religious, from submitting ourselves to the group and to the tradition that makes us stronger and better. It means if you're Christian, or if you're a pagan, or whatever other religion, means going to the assembly. It means regularly participating in the religious rituals and ceremonies with the people that are a part of your group. It means listening to and regularly reminding yourself of the stories that your group tells each other about. And it means worshiping the same God, whether that's Christ or the cold or the Constitution. And so, in closing, I think, and I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, I think that for the sake of our nation and for our race, and perhaps even for free speech, we would do best to put religiosity as our first item because the other things are too important to make first. Thank you.